Hi, my name is Talia. Welcome to Talia Nerds Out. This has been a far more difficult video to make than I thought it would be. Even with my notes, I can't quite seem to get my thoughts together, partially because the book of which I want to speak is a bit of a difficult topic in general, not only to discuss to a certain extent, but also for this person to have written. Of course, I'm speaking of my final book of quarter one of the Historathon 2023, which is The Eye of the Beholder, Deformity and Disability in the Greco-Roman World. This is a book by Robert Garland. It was written in 1995, so this is quite an old book. I do have one on a similar topic, infirmity in antiquity in the Middle Ages. This was written in 2015, but I am saving this for next year. That being said, this book starts out well for me because if you have been watching my channel for a little while, you might know that it is one of my huge pet peeves if an author goes into a book stating, or even, generally stating that they are going to be looking at this time period from through a modern lens, or even if they don't state it, but they do make it obvious that they are looking at this time period from a modern lens and judging the people of the era with our own values, expecting our knowledge, our culture to be the yardstick we measure these people by, which is not fair because theirs was a different culture, a different mindset. They had different understanding, different levels of science available to them. And that's where this particular book really needs to be taken in context, because the way that people who were disabled and deformed were treated in this time period was definitely by no means good. But it is important to take into account that the people at this time period, including people who were disabled and deformed, looked at disability and deformity in a very different way than the way we do today, just because of their lack of understanding of where this came from. They're not as advanced level of science, just so many different things that would be in play here. Different culture, physical perfection was something that was very much seen as the ideal, and you could say that in any culture, but you do see this in particular in Roman and Greek culture. Just if you look at their art alone, everything is idealized. I mean, the Greeks even had these are the measurements of perfection. That's not saying that every single person in ancient Greek looked like this. The average person probably didn't, but that was their ideal, and anything that would be considered deformed, anyone that would have been greatly off that mark, where things were obviously not right, there would have been definite concern and probably even fear. And you see this in multiple ways. But before I get started, at the beginning of this book, this author does state that this book is not his attempt to basically beat up on the Greeks and Romans of antiquity for not, like I said, not having our understanding. So anyway, I think I already said that. Going forward, to start from the very beginning, it talks about, well, they take this book in multiple steps. The beginning of the book, he tries to take from the evidence that existed at the time, the little bit of evidence about people who were actually known to be disabled and deformed in that period. There's not a lot of documentation because usually the people who had a lot of documentation about them were the important people of the time period. And it was very hard to be an important person of the time period and rise up to that level if you had a deformity or disability. You did have the people like Claudius, the Emperor Claudius, his type, and then you had, I believe there was a blind head of, not secret police, espionage, I guess is the best term for it, informers, for one of the other emperors. I don't think it was Nero or Caligula. It was one of the mad/bad emperors, but I can't remember which one. So he was noteworthy enough for being powerful, but also for the fact that he had some sort of physical disability and or deformity. I say and or because I don't know what caused him to be blind. If there was an actual deformity connected to that. But to even get to that point where you would reach those high positions and have disability and deformities, it took some doing. If you were not someone who got injured in war or in some other life incident. And it was sad to hear that just because you served your country didn't always mean that you were treated well after you were permanently damaged, lost leg. Well, if you managed to survive, the lost leg was, again, very different back then. Medicine wasn't to the same level. If you survived without dying from septicemia, you were really lucky. But it sounds like just because you gave something of yourself that made you deformed to your country, it didn't mean you got treated well, which is really sad. But the other thing that, okay, so say you weren't someone who got injured later in life, you were born with something. If you were obviously deformed upon birth in Rome, or I mean Sparta is the most obvious one I can think of for Greece, you would be presented to your father, and if in ancient Rome in particular, they would say if the father accepted that kid as their child, they would be permitted to survive. If they did not accept the child as their own, no matter what the reason, that child would be exposed. Now in Sparta, I believe it was pretty much guaranteed that if you were not physically intact and considered, not deformed or anything, if you had nothing wrong with you, and they considered you normal, they would then allow you to survive. But if you had any sort of deformity, it was pretty much automatic, from what I gather, that you were exposed. And this is based on Sparta's very strict idea of discipline and really utilitarianism. Your child wasn't necessarily your own, that belonged to the Spartan state, and it was pretty much guaranteed that kid would be a Spartan, a part of the Spartan army. It was not a choice. What I gather, I need to read more about Sparta, but that is what I am aware of in previous readings about that topic. But if you did manage to make it past your father's examination, you didn't get exposed, if you had a disability come up later in life, and I do wonder if this is what happened to Emperor Claudius, is maybe he didn't present as being deformed or disabled upon birth, and it was only later that they developed either seizures. There seem to be several emperors with seizures. I have heard stated that Caligula had seizures. I've heard that Claudius did as well. But the other thing I've heard about Claudius is the potential for Parkinson's. They talk about the fact that he would drool. They would talk about his shuffling gait. So some people have theorized that there might have been a Parkinson's a Parkinson's occurring. Obviously, this far ahead in time, we can't really tell what he would have had. It's really, you're basing it off of ancient sources, which could have either misrepresented symptoms, not listed all symptoms, not completely understood what they were looking at. It's very hard to make a diagnosis with such an amount of time in between. But it would be very hard to get to a point where you would have become a Claudius. Now, there were people like Homer. They also mentioned another young man who had, I can't remember what his disability or deformity was, but he had an amazing talent. I want to say he was an amazing musician, and he was so good that that there was a patron who was like, okay, I will make sure that you are able to work in your art. You're just too good. You will not starve. So he was one of the lucky few. A lot of times, your life wasn't necessarily going to be the most rosy if you managed to survive past being exposed, past the lack of medical advancement that would have permitted many people who have certain disabilities now from surviving back then. And then if you also survived past malnutrition, because there was plenty of time, I can think of ancient Rome in particular, where there wasn't enough grain to make bread, so the average person could easily have not had enough to sustain. And if you already had medical issues, that might have been your death now. But beyond all that, you managed to survive. You are an adult with a disability or a deformity. Now, this latter thing seemed to happen more among people who had obvious deformities. You hear a lot about people who had dwarfism or had other very obvious physical differences, where they became entertainment. And while this did help them stay in food and in clothes, in some ways putting them ahead of a lot of their fellows at that period, it did mean they had to put up with being humiliated on a daily basis for others' entertainment. Now, I don't know, they might have considered that a small cost for being able to live better than they would have on their own. I'm not sure what their point of view would have been on that. But those are people who would have been considered as probably doing well during that time period. People who definitely had it a lot worse were people who were deemed to be portents. So you hear of people who were conjoined, people who were hermaphrodites, people who just had these different deformities, being considered portents of evils to come, and then being drowned or otherwise killed in awful ways to try to make amends to the gods, or otherwise to try to avert the whatever disaster was expected. So that was not a great time to be someone deformed. I think that, especially without having our modern mindsets toward disability or deformity, I can see where somebody who would see their life choices either being someone who is starving on the street, being unable to support themselves, or being entertainment, or becoming a portent. I think that a lot of people probably would have preferred to have been the entertainment. Now, obviously, I can't be in their shoes, but I can see where someone might deem that as being the optimal choice, especially if they don't know any other life. The other thing that I was surprised to actually find out is apparently smith work was considered something that was kind of the purview of those who were deformed. And this is something you even see in the mythology. And I always mispronounce his name, Hephaestus, the husband of Aphrodite. He was physically deformed, and he was a smith. And from what I understand, that was partially because that was one of the jobs that someone who had physical issues, I'm guessing when they're talking about physical issues, they must mean lower limbs, because I would imagine that it'd be very hard to do smith work if you did not have use of your upper limbs. But from what he was saying in this book, that was considered the kind of job someone who was deformed could do, which I thought was interesting. I didn't know that. But the first part of the book, he isn't able to go as much detail as he probably would have liked, just because of a lack of information. He did talk about some attempts to take care of different medical ailments or deformities. He even talks about some actual cosmetic surgeries at the time, which I thought was interesting. But after he is able to put as much information together as he had available about actual people during that time period, he then goes off into mythology. And he has to reach a bit more here, just because mythology and legends and all that, that's not real. So he will take things like, okay, this person, first we'll go with the obvious. Okay, this person, he's disabled, he's blind, he can't walk well, he, whatever different thing that could be going on. How are they treated? And you see this with, if I always say it wrong, Hephaestus, Aphrodite's husband. He's constantly treated poorly by the other gods. And laughing at him is considered to be like an okay thing. And the other thing is there's a point where during the Trojan War, Achilles is kind of sulking in his tent, and he is called out by someone who I believe he was lame. And because he called Achilles out when no one else dared to, one of the other people actually ended up like beating him within an inch of his life. And no one really, there was an uncomfortable laughter, but from what it seems to be, I didn't read the actual source text, but the implication that the author of this book makes is that the laughter seemed to come from a place of discomfort with having someone of a lower status upbraiding someone of Achilles' status. And so having this person, this lame man, sort of taken down was a relief, and that's where the laughter was coming from. Now, I don't know whether or not that is true based on reading the source material. As I've mentioned, I did not read the source material. But if that is the case, it does give you another view into how disability or deformity was looked at during the time period. He also tries to make connections between maybe people who had different deformities and disabilities, and then mythological monsters. I think that one was a bit more of a stretch. I mean, I could see where you might say, I can kind of see where you might say, okay, this thing frightens me. Let me create this, trying to look at the mindset from someone in antiquity, where they might have been making these terrifying monsters to represent something that made them afraid in the real world. So I'm not sure exactly what a cyclops would have been supposed to represent, since, I mean, cyclops could see, so, I mean, it wasn't blindness. But that was one theory that this author puts forward. What I think is more telling, and he did mention this as well, is how the different, the other, whether it be the foreigner, the deformed, the disabled, are treated in the mythological tales, and how that reflects more on the behaviors they deem to be okay towards the other, the deformed, the disabled, the foreigner in real life. So it was considered okay to blind the Cyclops with one eye, or to, I mean, that's not the best example because he was, I mean, trying to eat them, but other points where someone who is considered the other, the different, the deformed, who would have been treated with less than mercy, or with less than understanding. Well, using the example of the man who was beaten for calling Achilles out. If these were the behaviors that were considered to be okay towards even the monsters, the other, the foreigner, the other, in the mythology, the argument could possibly be made, okay, is this how they viewed okay of treating the other? It might be a bit of a stretch, but I can see where the argument can be made that this was a worldview. That if you did not fit in the norm, you were not treated the way that the average person was supposed to be, or what would have been considered appropriate to treat the average citizen. Keeping in mind that if you were not a citizen, particularly in Rome, you could be looked to be treated poorly and have it considered okay. What else? I think that might be a lot of the main bulk of it. A lot of it was just, it had to be conjecture and trying to read between the lines, just because there wasn't a whole lot of hard source material to really dig your teeth into. I didn't mention everything that he mentioned that was hard source material, partially because I couldn't remember it, partially because I got to leave something in this book untouched. But I want to say more than about half the book was mythology and the suppositions he made based upon the mythology, which is a little bit more of a, it's not as firm of an area to walk on because it's not fact, it's supposition. That, I mean, people tell plenty of stories that don't necessarily reflect what we, I might create, I might write about, I don't know, a dragon or something, but it doesn't mean that I mean any specific thing when a hero kills a dragon or whatever. It doesn't necessarily reflect culture as a whole, even though I do understand that the stories of that culture do have some reflection, even if it's not in a one-to-one basis. Even if it's not saying, oh, this is how they treat the Cyclops, this means this is how they always treated people with X condition. Mythology does tell something about the culture. I'm just not sure if it necessarily tells strongly about their views towards disability. But it's an interesting idea. He does handle his argument well, and it's probably a good read for you if you're interested in his argument, to make up your mind for yourself if he proves his argument sufficiently in the writing of the text. I do think he did a good job. I would like to reread it when I'm in less of a rush to give it a closer examination, because I did have kind of mixed feelings on the way, on suppositions he was making upon the mythology. There were quite a few strong points, but I didn't always agree with the conclusions he came up with. But honestly, the main issue I had with the book wasn't actually in the main part of the book. It was in his conclusion. I think it was mainly the concluding chapter. And this is where he passes out of ancient Greece and Rome and starts delving into more of more of what he thought of things that are happening modern during his time period. He also stopped doing things completely in context. And what I mean by that is he was trying to, for most of the book, try to look at Rome and Greece in context of their culture. But he then ended up talking about how he had issues with Jesus and St. Augustine both mentioning how certain physical issues could have this other purpose meant by God, and he had an issue with that because he thought that took away from the humanity. I thought this showed a bias on his part, and I will explain why. He seemed to be of the viewpoint that by saying that something has a purpose for other people or even for yourself, but I think he was taking the view particularly for other people, that in and of itself takes away from the humanity of the person having the deformity or disability. And my response is, why not both? I am someone who has lived with disability for the past, I think I'm going on 6 years now, with where it's actually affected my life. And I can tell you that it doesn't, having the feeling of there being a purpose, or just having the idea that there's a purpose, does not take away from the humanity of the person experiencing the disability. It was not expressly stated by either Jesus or Augustine that this was all the person was. It was merely stated that, actually, if I remember correctly, the quote he brings out from Jesus is, they were asking about the man born blind, and the apostles asked Jesus, was this his sin or was it that of his parents? And Jesus essentially said that it was neither their sin, but this was intended to bring about the greater glory of God. And he went and he healed the guy from his blindness, and the guy got to have his blindness healed, and it brought attention to the miraculous power of God. So it didn't take away from this guy's humanity for this disability, in this case, to point towards something else. And Augustine is, I don't remember the quote from Augustine, but he could only come to terms with disability or these other difficulties if it had some greater part in God's plan. And so, again, I don't believe that takes away from the humanity of the person. When my disability was at its absolute worst, and I was still trying to work through it in the workplace, there was a point where it was so dark. You feel like there's no light at the end of the tunnel, that kind of dark, the kind of despair, hopelessness. if I had not felt like there was some other purpose that I did not see fully, that was beyond me, could possibly, if I could not see that, it could have, I don't know what, it could have been a really bad result for me. Because you need to have something to hang on to when you feel hopeless. And that's another thing I took issue with, besides the fact that this author, first of all, was criticizing that you couldn't have the idea of purpose and humanity. His other argument was, he mentioned a gentleman who he had been disabled in war. I think he lost his legs. And he was pushing himself to try to get back as close to his normal state of being as he could. And what he stated was that it didn't end up going well for this gentleman. He ended up ending his life. And the author makes the point that it was basically the fact that he was trying to reach some sort of social norm, that this is why he ended his life. Hence, this is a fault of society. And again, I argue against this. I can't say 100% for every person that this would not be the case. There probably is someone who feels like, oh, I'm not at social norms, I'm not worth it, whatever. There might be that case. But I'm not sure if the gentleman who wrote this book has never lived with a disability or anything like that, but the greatest enemy of somebody who is dealing with something that's not going to go away, a deformity, a disability, is not necessarily always going to be the inability to reach social norms. It's the hopelessness. It's the feeling that this problem isn't going away and there's nothing you can do about it. And so if that's all you can look at, if you don't have something else to hang on to, then that can lead to the result that he ascribed solely to the not being able to reach social norms. Yes, it might seem to be the same thing. He says it's because of not reaching social norms. This could be like, well, he's not reaching his social norms. See, he offed himself. Well, it's like, well, no. Is it because he didn't reach the social norms? Or if it's because he despairs of ever feeling like himself again? Because it can be incredibly difficult to feel like you have lost yourself. You don't know yourself anymore. And you feel everything slipping away. And this could be the despair that this person was facing. But the author kind of lost himself in his own bias towards the end, where he seemed to miss that point of view. And there's other things like, even if it isn't something that came upon you suddenly, there could be a point where you're tired of feeling dependent upon everybody. You're tired of just feeling helpless. You're tired of all these other things that have nothing to do with feeling that having this mean something, having your disability be seen as having this other purpose, this other meaning, has nothing to do with taking away your humanity. It's these other things. Your feeling of what you can't do, of what you want to do, of seeing other people in your age group pass you up, go to college, get a job, get married. And these are the things that I think is going to affect people where they are at. And this is where I feel like this author missed the point of what it is like to be someone living with a disability, a deformity. I don't have a deformity, so I can't speak entirely to that, but I would imagine feeling like someone that people are always looking at you. I mean, to a lesser extent, I know that when I was an ambulatory wheelchair user, because I would feel like I would pass out if I walked too long. So I would use a wheelchair in public. You always feel like people are looking at you, judging you, if you even are out of the wheelchair 1 second to get something from the shelf. Because in your head, you're like, they're going to think that I'm faking this. And yeah, no one's actually looking at you that much, but it doesn't mean it affects you any less in here. And so that's something else that is not completely addressed. Yes, that could be, I could see that aspect. You could argue that's societal, the feeling of shame. Yeah, that could be societal, but it could also be a matter of there's so many different things going into it. You can't merely blame society as being at fault entirely. Yes, there are things that can be done in society to make life easier for people who are disabled, deformed, whatever is going on, but it's so much more complex than just saying that if you give a further purpose to it, if someone else sees a further purpose to this, that's taken away from humanity. That's too black and white. There's a whole lot else going on under the surface when you're dealing with something so life-altering, so all-encompassing in your life, something that you live with, you learn to deal with. And my argument would be actually that, I don't know, it kind of actually takes that, so it's not just your identity, like, oh, I am this disability. No, this disability, I have this, but it also can have this effect for me on another level, spiritually, emotionally. It can have this effect on my family, on those around me, good, bad, ugly, indifferent. It takes on a whole different view. I'm rambling now, but yes, that part I thought he kind of missed the mark on that. Just because, yeah, I've already said that 20 million different times. I am going to end here. But, yeah, I mean, I guess if you are someone who is dealing with your own disability, I'm not even sure if we fully call it, you can say deformity, because I know that if someone comes out and they've got a deformation of a part of the body, that's a deformity, even if it's not considered PC or whatever to say that today. But regardless, if you are someone living with any of these issues, I mean, feel free to sound in how you particularly view this. Do you feel that by seeing something that you have as having a different purpose, does that feel to you like it's taking away from humanity? Like I said, I have my particular point of view, my particular experience, and I can see how hopelessness can take over if I did not have an idea of a different plan that I could not see. But it could be different for different people. And I think that's, like I said, that is what makes this an interesting and more complex argument than I think he acknowledged. Anyway, yeah, sound out in the comments that if it's even remotely something you feel like talking about. This I knew was going to be a little bit more than what most people are going to want for this book, just because I did feel like I had to address the conclusion as someone who is disabled and who has experienced before a level of darkness related to that, and so can speak to what he is alleging from my own personal experience. Anyway, thank you very much for joining me. I hope that you have a very blessed day, and I am headed to bed. I hope to record something later with book haul because, boy, do I have a lot of books to show you. All right. Thank you very much for joining me. God bless. Bye. Editing Talia here. I think what I failed to express in a coherent manner is that the feelings of hopelessness and self-worth aren't always tied to a societal idea of what is perfect and what is normal. It can also be what a person sees for themselves as constituting a quality of life that they feel worth living for. So for some people, they might not see living a life at less than a certain norm as being a life worth living. I think this is what I was attempting to express. What each individual person sees as being necessary for them living their best life, their most fulfilled life, may not look the same for someone else. And some people can adjust to a new norm, and some people just get so dark that they aren't able to, or they don't even want to imagine life without that norm. So that, I think, is what I was partially trying to express. Thank you very much for joining me for this very long and disjointed video. I hope that this wasn't too difficult to watch, and have a very blessed night or day, whatever it is for you. God bless.